Oh, go ahead. You want to start recording it?
Yep, and you're good to go then, sir.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Sam, and thanks, everyone. I apologize. I'm just a few minutes late there getting logged in, but Sam asked me if I would give an update on the flood risk management feasibility study that the Corps has been working on for Miles City. And many of you probably know that the Section 205 study has been terminated. And I'll talk a little bit about that, and that we're pursuing a GI or a general investigation study. But first, I was going to give a little background in case there was anyone new who wasn't aware of what we had done so far, and then talk about that GI program. So just as a quick overview, the history of the study is that Miles City requested Corps of Engineers assistance under the Section 205 program to help address flood risk. And under that program, the study, design, and construction costs are shared between the Corps and the non-federal sponsor. So the feasibility study, which is the phase that we were in that Section 205 study, is shared 50-50 federal, non-federal. Then design and construction is 65% federal, and long-term operations and maintenance is 100% non-federal. So that would have been Miles City as a non-federal sponsor. But the limitation on Section 205 is that the maximum total federal share is $10 million. So that includes everything spent on the study, design, and construction. And the study area that we looked at is shown here, outlined in red. I think everyone's probably pretty familiar with that. One thing I'll note here is that we have always said, and we would continue if we do a general investigation study, that the study area could be expanded if there's additional issues that are identified or additional areas of interest that are identified. And what we've done so far, or I'm sorry, what we would do is the overall process for a feasibility study, and this would be the same under Section 205 or the General Investigation Program, is that first identify the flood problem, then identify and evaluate different alternatives for managing the flood risk. And so those fall just real generally into structural alternatives like dams or levees, or non-structural alternatives like flood-proofing structures or relocating structures. And then the Corps is required to determine what's called the National Economic Development Plan, or the plan that contributes most to the national economy. And then other plans can be determined as well, like a locally preferred plan if the sponsor prefers something different than that NED plan. And then we would complete a feasibility study report and submit that for approval. And what we did in this study is 1, 2, and 3, which are all on the right bank of the Tongue River, and then Reach 4, which is on the left bank. And with those 4 study reaches, we looked at an evaluation of existing conditions. So essentially looking at what the existing flood damages are in each of those reaches. And we developed an initial array of alternative plans. So there's a little bit of history of what we did there. We had a workshop at Miles City in December of 2018. So it's been a number of years ago now. But then we did initial screening of those alternatives and reduced those down to 12 different levee alignments. And then we looked at those further to see if there were different options for specific areas, say using a flood wall instead of a levee in an area where real estate was particularly constrained. And then we did a preliminary economic analysis of those levee alignments and some non-structural measures. And as a quick summary of the alignments that we looked at, this shows the different alignments, generally following the alignment of the existing levee. And then we also looked at a setback alignment, which is set back from the current levee alignment and would terminate before it kind of turned and went down along the Yellowstone River. And just, I guess, kind of as a reminder, we looked at this sitback levee alignment because when we looked at those initial levee alignments that I showed, we were finding that they were not economically feasible using the criteria that we have for project justification. And so this just is a summary of the preliminary results that we found. So the full length levee on the current alignment, and again, that would be using essentially this collection of levee segments to make an alignment on the current alignment, the full length. And we had two kind of bookends, I guess, on that alignment. We had low riprap and high riprap. And so the riprap is basically just a large rock that is used to armor the bank. And we had to make assumptions about what would be required for riprap. And in particular, along the stretch that follows the Yellowstone River, it was quite high, the amount of riprap and the size that we had to assume. So you can see that when we made a very low assumption for riprap, we had a cost of about $36.7 million as a total cost. And when we made a high assumption, we had a cost of about $69.7 million. The benefits of those two are the same because they would both protect the same area. And so you can see the net annual benefits with the low riprap were about 400,000, but with the high riprap were about negative 706,000. And so at the low riprap assumption, the project would have been considered feasible by our economic justification criteria, but at the high end, it would not have been. And in either case, the total cost would have been more than what's allowed under the Section 205 program. So we decided under the Section 205 study not to spend a lot of money trying to refine that riprap estimate, because regardless, the project was still over the Section 205 project cost limit. And instead, we looked at this setback levee along this alignment generally, so back from the Tongue River and not running along the Yellowstone River. And with that, there was an elimination really of the riprap requirement because of the setback. So you can see the annual benefits go down because it doesn't protect as large of an area. But then the cost, we again had kind of a range of costs depending on our assumptions, ranged from about $18.5 million to $23.5 million. And so that yielded net annual benefits of between about dollars. So both of those setback levee alignments would have, at least on the preliminary analysis that we did, would have been justified economically, but still they're both above the Section 205 cost limit, not as much as the full length levee, but still above the limit. And so kind of a summary of those results is that the actual riprap requirement would be somewhere between that low and high estimate. So there could be an economically feasible levee project that's either on the current alignment or the setback alignment. But because of that maximum project cost for Section 205 of about $15 million, the project couldn't be implemented under the Section 205 program. And we looked at non-structural measures as well, but those wouldn't be economically feasible just because of the large number of structures that would be required to be flood-proofed. So when we think about non-structural measures for this study, the area where those might apply would be more on the left bank of the Tongue River where there are fewer structures. So maybe instead of trying to protect those completely with a levee, for example, additional non-structural measures could be done on that left bank to protect individual structures. But as a standalone alternative non-structural measures were not economically feasible. And then we also found, we did a preliminary life loss analysis that would indicate that there'd be the potential for loss of life from more severe floods, and that can sometimes be used as a non-economic justification, but we didn't think that would be a strong enough justification to overcome the fact that we were above the Section 205 cost limit, or in some cases, maybe not economically justified. And so we identified kind of the remaining study tasks that would have to be done would be to refine that preliminary project design and the cost estimate and economic analysis. And then we would have to analyze environmental and cultural resource impacts and design any required mitigation. So, you know, if there's any impacts to those environmental or cultural resources, like tree removal, for example, we would have to design that mitigation. And then we would have to do our draft feasibility and final feasibility report and our NEPA, or environmental documentation. So those we do a draft report that would be reviewed, and then a final report that we would submit for review and approval. So those are kind of the remaining study tasks that we had identified. But when we looked with the city at study options, Section 205 was really no longer an option unless there was an increase in the Section 205 project cost limit, and that to date has not happened. And so we looked at the possibility of continuing under that general investigations, or GI program, that I mentioned earlier. And so the difference really, the only difference between the Section 205 and GI program in terms of cost share, you can see that the feasibility study is still a 50-50 cost share. Design and construction is still a 65-35 cost share. Operations and maintenance is still 100% non-federal, but the maximum total federal share is unlimited for a GI study. So that Section 205 project cost limit that we were running up against is removed with the GI program. Now the catch, if you will, is that the Section 205 program is what's called a continuing authority. So the Corps of Engineers gets funding each year for conducting Section 205 studies and for implementing Section 205 projects. So if a project is approved for implementation under Section 205, then there's no separate authorization needed to implement the project. It can just be implemented as soon as funding is available. With the GI program, a project needs to be approved to enter the GI program, and then once a feasibility study is approved, there is a specific authorization by Congress before the project can be implemented. So it's basically a higher bar in order to start a GI study and to implement a GI project. So we talked about that with the city, what the options were and what the differences between Section 205 and the GI program are. And in October of 2022, the City Council in Miles City voted to pursue a GI study. So since that time, we have gone through the process of winding up the Section 205 study, which involves, you know, making sure that all of the work in kind that the City of Miles City did as part of the cost share got credited. And then we have to basically balance the books. So make sure that the 50-50 cost share is balanced. And then we closed out that study. And once that was closed out, we were able to request a GI study. And so the city supported that request by providing a letter of support from the city, and then letters of support from other stakeholders in the city, county, and state of Montana, or not the county of Montana, excuse me, but in Custer County, and then the state of Montana. And we went ahead and put in that GI study request. So what we know right now is that the FY25 President's budget has been released, and GI study funding for Miles City was not included in the FY25 President's budget. So that's the federal fiscal year that begins on October 1st, 2024. So it's not included in the president's budget. Now, that is not to say that it might not be included in the final budget for FY25, but we just haven't seen that yet because Congress, of course, determines the budget, but the president starts that process, and it wasn't included in that FY25 budget. Now, the Corps has done what we call expressing capability for the study in both FY24 and FY25 in our work plan. So fiscal year 24 started October 1st of 23, and of course, we're about halfway through it, and the Congress didn't pass a budget until recently, and so that work plan is being developed. It hasn't been finalized yet. So we've expressed the capability in fiscal year 24 and also for fiscal year 25. So there's a possibility that even if it's not in the budget for either of those years, and it's not for FY24, but if for example, the Corps identified excess funds somewhere in its budget, those can be, there's a process that can be gone through to, fund it in the work plan. So we are still waiting to see if that would happen for FY24, and then of course for FY25. And then finally, we've also expressed capability for the study in our FY26 president's budget request. So basically for the 3 years that we go out in our budgeting for FY24, our current year, and then FY25, which is the next year, and FY26 next year plus 1 year, we've expressed capability for the study and are just waiting to find out if it gets funded. And if it gets funded in any of those years, we can start the study. The process that we would go through is we would have to develop a feasibility cost sharing agreement, similar to what we did for the Section 205 study, but it's a new agreement. And then after that, we could, restart the study. And under the GI program, we wouldn't have to go back to square one, but we would have to, like I said, there's a bit higher bar for the GI program. So we would have to kind of review the work that we've done and then continue that work. And we would have to decide with the city, do we want to, for example, now include protection for that Reach 3, which is the area along the Yellowstone River? Do we want to expand the study area? Questions like that, because that federal cost limitation is removed with GI. So that's really, I guess, the summary right now. And Sam, if there are any questions that anyone has, or if there are any things that you'd like me to try to cover in more detail, I could.
Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Fitzgerald?
Have they figured out how many structures would be lost in the setback style?
So the question was, have we figured out how many structures would be lost if we did the set? The answer to that question is we did that on a preliminary basis. So what we did is we looked at that alignment, and we, for structures that were significantly impacted, we assumed a cost for like buyout and relocation of the structure, just to capture that cost. And then for structures that were maybe less impacted, or where we thought that they could be avoided by using, say, a flood wall instead of a levee, we made that assumption. So we made real high-level assumptions for all of those structures that could potentially be impacted, and that was just to determine a preliminary cost estimate. If we were to proceed with any alignment that impacts real estate, there's a much longer and more detailed process that we would go through to determine those impacts and determine how we would mitigate those. And we haven't done that detailed process yet. Does that answer the question?
Well, not necessarily, because I don't know how many, but it after you said that you would have to go through that process anyway, one of the things was like, if you determine a house in that area needs to be removed, the process that you go through is like you just have to start negotiating, and you guys haven't even gone down that road yet as far as determining how many actual structures and that it would impact yet.
Yes, so that's correct, and I can just real briefly outline the process. Like for any real estate that needs to be acquired for any project that the Corps does, we generally do pretty preliminary real estate estimates, like I described, when we're looking at alternatives and when we're comparing alternatives. Now, when we narrow it down to what we call our tentatively selected plan, which is the plan that we, along with the sponsor, have agreed we would like to be the plan if everything kind of checks out in the feasibility study process. We do what's called a gross appraisal. So someone from our Corps of Engineers real estate division here in Omaha would look at those properties on a more individual basis and do, again, it's called a gross appraisal because it's still relatively preliminary. But we do that to get a better idea of what the cost is for that cost estimating. And then if the project actually moves forward, the federal government does not acquire real estate, or I should say at least the Corps of Engineers doesn't require real estate. I don't know about other parts of the federal government, but the Corps of Engineers doesn't acquire real estate for our projects. We rely on our non-federal sponsors to do that. So in that case, you know, like if there's a project moving forward, then say Miles City is going to be the sponsor, they need to do the real estate acquisition process, which there's federal guidelines they have to follow. So they have to do a detailed appraisal of any properties, and then they have to negotiate with the property owner to acquire that property. And the Corps of Engineers, even though we don't do that process, we review to make sure that the price that's being offered is, you know, fair under federal regulations and so on. So that process only happens when we get quite a bit further along to really determining a project that we would like to implement. Does that help answer the question a little more, at least to kind of outline the process?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Gary Cridland here. Has the city determined or chosen any alignments out of those that you have?
I don't know if that's a question for Sam or for me, but so out of the alignments that we have, we didn't make any sort of determination as far as one that we thought we would want to recommend. We've really gotten just as far as figuring out if we think there's something that meets our economic justification criteria, because that's kind of the bottom line for whether a project would be approved, is whether it has positive net annual benefits. So beyond just determining that we think there could be a feasible project, the Corps hasn't determined or recommended a preferred alternative. And I don't think that the city has either, but I'll let Sam or someone else address that.
No, the city has not yet. We have only expressed interest in what we would like to see, but that has not happened yet. I don't think we're far enough along to really make that determination. And also we would get public input on it before we did anything. We just have, this is what we would like to see.
And that's a good point that Sam made about public input, that we did have some public meetings as part of the Section 205 study, but if we were to start a GI study, we would be required to have scoping meetings for that study as well. So we would come and do public meetings again to get input on the scope of the study and what should be considered.
Anyone else have any questions for Mr. Pissarro?
Again, how long do these studies usually take to complete?
So the question was, how long does the general investigation study usually take? I'm sorry, I wanted to make sure I heard the question correctly. Sam, can you hear me still?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I'm not sure I heard the gentleman's question. I think it was, how long does the general investigation study take? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the timeline that the Corps of Engineers is supposed to meet for a GI study is to complete it in 3 years from the time we sign a feasibility cost sharing agreement. That doesn't always happen, but I think that for Miles City, we would have a pretty good likelihood of meeting that timeline, especially because of the work we've already done in the Section 205 study. Like I said, we wouldn't have to redo all of that work. We could build on that in the GI study. So generally speaking, it'd be about a 3-year timeline.
About how much have we done in that 3 years?
Chris, the question was, how much has been done within the setting that with the 205? So how much would the 3 years actually be? Would it be less, about the same?
It would probably end up being about the same, maybe slightly less than 3 years, because there are review processes that we have to go through in a GI study that kind of, I won't say dictate the schedule, but you can only reduce the schedule so much because those review processes still need to be done. But I would say maybe a safe estimate would be like between 2 and 3 years to complete a GI study, given the work that's already been done.
Does that make the cost of the study a little bit less then? Since some of it's already been taken care of?
Yes, the cost of the study, we should expect it to be less than it otherwise would be, because of work that's already been done. And the study cost wouldn't really be determined until that scoping for the GI study, because it would be based on the scope that's determined working with the non-federal sponsor, so with the city. So for example, if we decide we really want to focus on providing protection all the way down the Tongue River through town and then around along the Yellowstone River, that's obviously a different scope than if we say we're going to continue to focus just on the right bank of the Tongue River. So that whatever decision is made for the scoping really has an impact on the budget and also to some degree the schedule of the study.
So the decision, or when the city decided to go forward with the GI study in 22, I think you said,
Yeah.
Did they determine a scope of how much they were going to do at that point or not?
No, the scope wasn't determined at that point. Really, the only determination that was made then was that the city would like to pursue as the non-federal sponsor of the GI study because be implemented under that GI program. So the scope wasn't set at that time, and I think, you know, I recall from some of the discussions that one consideration was that under a GI study, the scope could be changed from, you know, the focus under the Section 205 was just on really the right bank of the Tongue River, And the reason for that is because we knew that the cost of levee along the Yellowstone River would be more than the Section 205 cost limit. We kind of knew that very early on. But I recall, and Sam, you correct me if I'm wrong, but that some of the discussion about why a GI study might, might be desirable action along the Yellowstone River, in addition to the Tongue River, because we don't have that cost limit. But the actual scope hasn't been determined yet.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, thank you, Chris, for taking the time to give your update to us. Always appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Sam, and thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
You have a wonderful night.
Okay, you too. Thank you.
All right, bye.